we had prepared a number of questions that come out of an essay that we both, Alexandra and I, wrote recently, published in Contemporânea. But actually, we're going to step a bit outside of the script and just sort of engage with a couple of questions and open up to you guys, who I'm sure have a number of burning questions as well, and comments and statements are welcome as well. And I guess I would start by making a bridge for those of you who were not in the first half of the afternoon. I would like to do just a short bridge to the things that we've been discussing this afternoon. And maybe I would start actually by the end of your performance, Minor Matter. And there's this moment at the end where the white light comes in and you really sort of see the infrastructure of the theater. And you see the theater completely naked. You see the boxes and the chairs and the whole stage laid bare for what happened before and with the lights. And one of the things that we've been discussing today has been infrastructural support, care, practices and ways of working together within institutional settings, mostly with contemporary art, but we also, Susanne Calot did a wonderful presentation on institutional analysis, focusing on the practice of Tosquelles and, sorry for my Argentinian accent here, for Tosquelles and Guattari. And this was preceded by a talk by Elena Rickett called Support Acts. So I was wondering, in these games that you rehearse with the dancers, where you have these sort of gestures of falling out, of coming together, of enacting solidarity, of enacting resistance and struggle. Is this part of your working methodology? Is this something that overflows from this performance?
Yeah, so I was ultimately, with this group of three, I was interested in all different forms of assemblage and different ways to organize ourselves around actually difference, which is maybe not what one might assume, considering that it is an ensemble of three Black dancers. So inside of this idea of organization of three different bodies, I was interested very much in the sort of dissonance, rather than, so often like these notions of community or coming together are very harmonic. It's built around these ideas of sameness, which get over-articulated, I think, or overly assumed in some ways, and so I was interested in when the thing doesn't work, but sort of in it's not working, sort of what's at stake when the thing is falling apart, and finding different ways in which we can sort of either catch one another or also miss. But yeah, so I was kind of interested doubly in that, the sort of dissonance of organizing bodies. Also the kind of the possibilities of failure, also as a way to organize. So yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, I can refer. I mean, for those of you that are familiar with the work of Simone Forti, she has this like really beautiful choreography called Huddle. It's a sort of canonical and work. It's also quite iconic. But and I've actually done it with her in Los Angeles, and it was just it's as beautiful as it is. It's sort of built around consensus. You all agree that we're going to get one body over this huddle safely, right? And for me, I just in this particular work, once the sort of fiction is gone, once we sort of lose the fiction of the theater and we enter into the reality of the situation, I thought it was an interesting evocation to also invite the realities of trying to be together, actually, which are also often like difficult. So
I would like to picking up this idea about space and spatiality, and also matter and materiality. You work a lot with lights and soundscape, and I was interested if you could explore the way materiality is built and disrupted also in the theatrical apparatus. This would be like a question about matter and space. And the other thing, picking up this idea about fugitivity
Yeah.
and bringing up like Fred Moten's idea about the Baroque fugue and the soundscape, the music, and how he relates blackness to fugitivity. So maybe you can also relate this to materiality.
Yeah, of course. It's that's a very dense question, but I'll try to at least articulate certain methods that I've used in order to develop material. So for me, I work very associatively. So I was riffing off of a Fred Moten text, Blackness and Nothingness, Mysticism in the Flesh. And I was very interested in finding ways to dance around certain themes relating to blackness and the black box. So for me, it's rather than arriving at a certain kind of essence or a truth of concept, I instead sort of danced myself around certain ideas and certain themes, and that was what I was specifically interested in this work was how our bodies sort of perform, how to create at least a sort of feeling of futurity, so a way in which I was trying to play with time and how time unfolds and how the bodies sort of emerge through time, was to play with a sound score that begins in early Renaissance and sort of moves all the way to the immediate present, which is the final moments of the piece. There's no sound and you have the actual present moment of the situation. And then in the way in which I was dealing with, the materiality or the physicality of this particular work was working through different sort of iconic materialities, like playing with the different iconicities of the body, how the body historically is represented, and trying to arrive at, there's a very interesting, I'm going to find my way back to the center, but there's a very interesting text, it's actually a Horton Spiller's text, where she sort of makes the distinction between the body and the flesh. And I would argue that throughout most of Western historical, more commonly in Western European representations of the body, you have a very clear, it's very clearly sort of articulated or represented, let's say, and then you have this whole question of the flesh, which is something, and enfleshment, which is something that sort of emerges out of reflecting on what is it like when you have no longer a clear body that's yours, because historically you were either the very complicated relationship to the way in which the black body has been used or represented, let's say. So I was interested in this distinction. So in the beginning, we sort of morph through more like iconic images. So we're really busy with the body. And then by the end, trying to arrive at the fleshiness of this body, right? So then to sort of, even to the point at the end, we're doing all of these really silly gestures of killing ourselves, but in a way, it was a way to also kill the self, to become the mass, this undifferentiated mass, actually. So that then, and
yes, that also brings up this idea of matter, of filling the space with matter. I imagine like this undifferentiated mass.
Yeah, this question of representation, particularly, I think, for artists of color, is this thing that if you inscribe the black body into a canon, that suddenly this is like somehow emancipatory or somehow suggestive of progress. And so I sort of disagree with that position. But so there's a sort of radical turn. So we play with different forms of representation, and in a way to sort of make that thick, this sort of representation thick, is adding sound, adding light. So I was just interested in the thing never becoming stable. So referring to this idea of fugitivity, it's a term that both Saidiya Hartman and Fred Moten often refer to in relationship to blackness, and what makes it so intriguing and so compelling is that it's always on the run. It's something you can actually never grasp. It actually isn't representable. So I was interested in playing with time and this sort of endless unfolding, like a fugue, this thing of like this endless unfolding, and linking this idea of maybe this ornament, this performative this piece, this object it's like a difficult, I wanted it to be like a difficult object to hold in a way.
Of course.
Like that it doesn't clearly, and it doesn't have a clear goal, let's say. Like, yeah. So.
Maybe we could open to the audience. I'm sure there's a lot of questions.
There's a mic floating around, so feel free to grab your turn.
In Portuguese,
And,
if you want.
listen.
In Portuguese, we can translate if you prefer.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Valentine Tanz, and I would really like to show or express my gratitude for amplifying this tenderness and softness that I really felt resonated with, that it really kind of went through all my body, through all my senses. And what was really striking for me was your sonic sensitivity, the sonic presence of bodies and feelings and emotions. And I don't know if I'm right, but I have recognized a moment of Donna Summer, I Feel Love. And that really kind of nurtured me in this moment of being there with you. And I just fall, my eyes closed, and I really went on this journey with you. And also saying thank you for bringing those three bodies on stage in institutional context. I really find it extremely political and extremely important to see that and experience that in this context of festivals in Europe. So yes, thank you for that. Maybe I could have a question regarding your choice of aesthetic of dance, of how you choreograph that and where it comes from, because I'm not familiar with your background, so
Yeah, no
it would be wonderful to hear your thoughts on that. You mentioned Yvonne Reiner,
Yeah,
and
for sure.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. The piece is made up of multiple forms of embodiment, and at some points very obvious choreographic moments, and then also where that sort of dissolves and turns into just three bodies in space, that then emerges again into like a social cacophony of materialities. But I guess the most iconic moment of the piece would be the bolero, and it's a reference to Bajart's bolero, which is actually a solo. It's made for one sort of protagonist and an ensemble that dances around the soloist. So I sort of appropriated that and thought, if there's what happens when the solo becomes the trio. So then I worked on, there's this dance form called step. It's a dance form that's popular in the United States. It's often performed at sports events. It's also performed within fraternities and sororities, and it's a very sonic. It's based on it's like a sounding body. So it's based on rhythm and attack, and so that's what that material is sort of sourced from. And also, what's interesting, it has a historical link also to gumboot, which is a South African folk dance. And in the original ensemble, there was Tami Mankela, who's South African, who grew up dancing gumboot. And this is something that is still performed today, and it is actually a protest dance. It's something that even the coal miners were dancing against the colonial power. And so it was a way to sort of organize. It was also a dance of resistance. And for me, what was particularly interesting about this is how within the Black diaspora, how things sort of travel in time. So you have this gumboot dance in South Africa, and then you have an interesting version or iteration of it that formalizes into a thing called step in the United States. And so for me, that's what's interesting also about culturally about Blackness, is that in the way in which it travels in different bodies. So yeah, that was sort of the source material. But it's also and also, of course, my dance history, learning concert dance and learning all of these things. So it's very hybrid in a lot of ways. But and then there's headbang, there's like death metal. I mean, there's a lot of different sort of references inside of the piece, and I work a lot with sort of iconic like images, and different ways in which we read bodies. So for me, that's what I'm very interested in, the translation of embodiment, right? And so how culture performs itself on a body, but also how a body can sort of create space for other possibilities. So to even enter into the space of not knowing. Right, so culture has a tendency to over-determine what a body is. And so I was kind of interested in both the spaces, both the social inscriptions, particularly of a Black body, but then also the kind of spaces or holes where it hasn't been determined yet. Yeah.
So while we wait for, there's a question over
I
there.
don't know that I need a microphone.
We're recording, so we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
You referenced Trump, Donald Trump, but I'm British, so I had a moment of horror when I heard the words Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
And I wondered why such a local figure could kind of pop up in your piece. Why Nigel Farage?
Oh, why? Oh, just, I mean, one shouldn't take it too seriously or too literally.
Too seriously.
Yeah. Okay, good. But I think, I mean, this piece was, just to give it a little context, so this piece was developed before Donald Trump was actually elected. So we ended up keeping it. So I was working with a performer, Jonathan Gonzalez, and we were a little bit riffing like on the things that are overly present, right? They're overly present in the media. So, and it's a light reference, right? So it's kind of like, oh, Nigel Farage, Donald Trump, they're a mess. But I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about this other thing. So it's a little bit of the noise of the time, right?
Kind of riff, yeah.
Yeah, totally. So it shouldn't bear more meaning than, yeah.
It doesn't bear meaning anyway, but
Okay.
thank you.
Well, while we wait for another question, as I was just mentioning to Ligia, we opened the session by citing a statement from Guattari from 1989, which is the same year that Bell Hooks wrote a canonical essay that Ligia shared with us as one of her references, in which she sort of positions language as a place of struggle, very literally, where she mentions the sentence occurs many times during the text. And at the same time, now riffing to your question, which we would like to think to begin with, the sonic expression and the way in which you sort of place weakness, and I'm borrowing this term from Brandon LaBelle, a Goldsmith scholar, where he says that positioning with oneself within sound is recognizing the weakness of your position, and the weakness becomes a strength. Mm-hmm. And this sort of goes back to Hooks and the way in which marginality is a place for resistance, where language is a place for dissidence, and back to Guattari, where the linguistic and the collective linguistic practices that Susanna rightly mentioned are also a way of shifting the way in which we can conceive embodiment as a sort of not a private, not an interrelated, but a trans-individual matter. So sort of, I was wondering if you can expand on how this idea of working with language and voice and orature and poetry, that you bring all these references into the performance, how does the text become matter?
That's a good point. Throughout the piece, the texts have very different performative intentions. So the piece opens with a poem, both to the theater and to the inhabitants. And then you have the more iconic sort of stand-up moment. And that's a very iconic moment. It's very presentational. It is what it is. It's the showman. And then my voice is also morphed and distorted, and then there's later in the piece Tiran's talk on the periphery, and it's more like he performs more like an utterance. Mm-hmm. So it's just, and it's almost to this, like the to the black void or to the space, So without, so it's sort of like what emerges in real time, kind of. It's an invitation to be in real time and to sit in that kind of space of nothingness, if we can call it that. So. So for me, I was just interested in all of the different sort of sonic resonances of language, and not to give it too much importance, because I mean it's constantly shifting. For me, I don't see language as text any differently than I see body as text, any differently that I see sound as text. So all of these things are sort of texts, and I'm interested in bending the text to create a certain kind of texture. So it's a little bit of like painting with all these sort of different performative modes and possibilities. So yeah, I'm very interested in that, how we can bend language or bend the way we hear it, and sound. Like, for me, the entire piece is built around sound. This piece is like a sounding sound box, totally, like a stereo or something. Yeah.
So, does anyone want to contribute?
Hello. I was very interested. There's a sense of infinite, as the piece starts very. It's difficult to identify what we see, and little by little we see things, but still very difficult to identify. It was interesting to hear you saying this of something that is on the run, that is not catchable, unless you try to relate it as being the run, as you are also in the run. And I got curious about, it's a trilogy, it's part of a trilogy, this piece. And I would be curious to know about the other pieces, what they relate to.
Totally. So with this trilogy, I'm sort of working on pieces that are built with a sort of strong antagonism, let's say, to the world or to this world, let's say. And so I'm using sort of fiction or a fictive landscape to kind of articulate that. So Saraswag is the first piece. I'm not performing in it. Now it's Andrew Hardwidge, originally Brian Getnick. And I'm sort of playing with canonical text, and it's a piece that very much works with language and turning language and text into a sounding material. And I work around this idea of a primal scream, which is actually a reference to Beckett's Not I, it's Billy Whitelaw who performed it originally. And she talks about Samuel Beckett's Not I, this famous work from 71 of his. It's like an 11-minute monologue. It's really beautiful. But she describes it as a primal scream. So I'm very interested in the sonic resonance of that scream and how I could create a landscape in which that scream could actually happen in the frame of the theater. And so in a way, for me, I'm working as that scream sort of has a disruptive force in some ways in terms of representation. It suddenly, it sort of falls outside of the things that we totally understand or know. And so I'm interested in sort of testing the borders of representation, let's say, inside of this trilogy. And I was working on grief and sadness in that one, and it's set in a saturated blue. And then the next piece, I'm in the process of sort of doing research, but I'm working on a new piece that'll premiere later this year, and I'm thinking about this idea of the feminine. And after a piece like Minor Matter, I turn to the feminine and to find sort of also spaces to invoke maybe an end. So also or a will to an end of something, a certain regime, a certain way of understanding, a certain way of doing things. And I'm interested in sort of turning the sort of construction of the melodrama inside out. So I'm going to make a melos drama, so a sonic drama. or that's what I'm busy with, thinking about that, how I can do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe one final question before we move to the next presentation. There we go. Go for it.
The question that pops up now in my mind is a question about healing, because I feel healed in a way, because your work also has provided me kind of a timelessness zone where I believe in this timelessness the healing can take place. And this also relates to Nina Simone, who said, what do we do with this lovely, lovely thing?
Sorry, say that one more time.
With Nina Simone, who said, what do we do with this lovely thing called time? And the time is a dictator, and I really find your work subversing the notion of time. And that question of healing, like how do you see that as a strategy for choreography making and for revolutionary work, which could be a healing work?
That's a good question. Wow. I love the Nina reference, for sure. It's funny because I never think of it in terms of healing, or I never want to presume that that's the goal. I never want to, I don't want to have an end to this space in which I'm sort of mining, right? So for me, it would seem almost presumptuous to assume that what this might do is heal anyone. Like I was, to be honest, I was really surprised when after the premiere there were people crying. I was like, why are they crying? Like, don't they know this piece is against the world? Like, we're like, so it's, so yeah, I think that maybe healing is, I don't know, that's a very difficult question. Maybe I have to sit with that a bit longer.
If I may jump into here, there was a very interesting article that was written by a common friend of ours that sort of she's an art critic and coming from the art world, called Anesthetic Aesthetics. And she was sort of drawing onto some topics that we briefly mentioned today, sort of the sense of anxiety, the burning out, the long exhaustion, and how after this performance premiered, everyone who was in the room sort of felt a relief. And there was a sense of relief that was collectively shared. And so she did highly recommended reading. She did a very beautiful reading of this, but suddenly from your question, what it reminds me is that perhaps in the different contexts in which it is performed, maybe for the art world, maybe we do need healing, and we sort of read it as such. Sorry, and that brings me to maybe to sort of round up. You mentioned that Sorrow Swag works on grievance and sadness, and here you have a more celebratory attitude towards the body. So maybe this is something that we can close this conversation with, what your views on on celebration.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it also links a lot to the way Fred is sort of riffing on the possibility of celebration, Black celebration specifically, as a space for radical thought. And so he doesn't distinguish between Deleuze and Guattari and the club. So for him, these are two radical spaces in which there's endless possibility, right? So I think that this idea of celebration and like what can happen in the moment of gathering is something that we can't fully determine. You create the conditions for the gathering, and you see what happens, right? So I think that for me, also like this piece emerges out of a lot of political strife, and I do think that there is a saturation of Black death that we've gotten accustomed to. We've gotten used to seeing, Black bodies like suffering, and in some ways it's to the point where it's become even grotesque, even the conditions that allow for Black suffering to continue in the name of entertainment or in the name of, it once again becomes commodified very easily. So for me, so my goal was, in recognizing that, what the backdrop is to this work, also to create something that might be a possibility of a way out of that very obvious turn to reinscribe suffering, I think is tricky, and so this is something that I was trying to avoid. Celebration has this double thing for me. There is reason still to celebrate, even despite the fact that, we're inside of something that is at its end, I think, hopefully. And we're there to will its end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you guys so much.